All right, everybody, let's get started if we can. Glenn Tate here from the Law Society. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Um, our speaker today in the speaker series of What Reconciliation Means to Me is Dëneze Nakehk'o. Dëneze is Dehcho and Denesuline Dene from Denendeh. He's a strong advocate for Indigenous knowledge systems, particularly Dene ways of knowing. Des is one of the founding members of Dene Naho. He works at encouraging and supporting connections and reconnections to the land, language, and culture. Dneze is a public speaker that recognizes and actively confronts the impacts of colonialism through Dene methods of decolonization. He has over a decade's worth of experience in Northern media and communications. He's originally from Liidlii Kue, but now lives in Yellowknife with his family. Des has got a PowerPoint presentation for us that's going to supplement his talk. Again, a reminder, if you've got any questions, just shoot them through to me through the chat function, and I'll pass them on to Dneze. Des, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Glenn. It's good to have this connection with Glenn. I know we did some volunteer work with basketball NWT. It's good to see him in his work mode. So thanks for that introduction there, Glenn. Yes, I'm currently in Yellowknife right now. I'm just going to start off in my language. I just want to say Masi so Dene, Sila Dneze Nakehk'o Suje, Nakehk'o Gotsiati. My name is Dneze Nakehk'o, and I'm originally from Nakehk'o. The colonial denomination is Fort Simpson. My father is Jim Antoine, former leader, former premier of the Northwest Territories. And my mother is Celine Antoine. She's Dneze Plene or Chippewan, originally from Yellowknife, Snowdrift. Also, on my mom's side, her mom, my grandmother Judith, Judith's father is Ja Lockhart. And in Yellowknife, the community of Yellowknife, there are community halls called the Ja Lockhart Community Center, and that's like my great-great-grandfather. And on that side of the family, that was the last in a line of hereditary chiefs with Ja. On my father's side, I have Jim Antoine, my grandpa William, and William's father, my great-grandfather, his name was Nakehk'o, and that's where I got my last name from, Nakehk'o. And his father was Itziro in between Fort Simpson and Wrigley. And Itziro means big grandpa, and he was the leader of that area as well too. So on both sides of my family, I have leadership and I guess public speaking in my family. So I have to, if I'm thrust into the public speaker role, then I have to blame my parents, blame them or give them credit for that. But I just wanted to share a little bit about that, about my family background. So I've been asked here to speak a little bit about reconciliation, what reconciliation means to me. It's the buzzword now, and trying to achieve that as a destination has definitely been a journey that we're all on. And like any journey, some of us know where we're going and some of us have no idea where we're going as well too. And I think that's the whole idea about reconciliation. I know in this English language, reconciliation has more to do with accounting, I think. You got to reconcile the books, but it also comes through the church as well, too. I think the church has kind of utilized that word. Basically, it means to get back to a point where we had a good relationship in the past. But unfortunately, I think in this country of Canada, because of the impacts of colonization, residential school, the ongoing actions of colonization and the mentality and the attitude of colonialism is still really prevalent across the country, at least from an Indigenous perspective. And that's this perspective I'm going to share with you today. I'm Dene from Denendeh, and I know I have leadership in my family. And so I've grown up at Dene leadership meetings all over the North, and either by listening or not listening or through osmosis, a lot of these things have kind of soaked into me. And also just to, before I get into it, that this is from a Dene perspective, this is from my own perspective. These are things that I picked up along the way of my life's journey that have helped me to make sense of the world around me. And these are the things that I'd like to share with you. I'm not trying to share this and assign blame or to make people feel bad or this is not the case. This is to just to try to provide a little bit more understanding. In this country of Canada, there's a huge knowledge gap when it comes to what Canada thinks it is and the reality of the situation from an Indigenous perspective. So with that, I'm just going to try to be tech savvy and share this screen with you. I have a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share with you. Yeah, so we'll just get going. Usually this PowerPoint, it's the beginning of it. I call it, let's see, this is better. It's usually understanding and standing up to colonialism. It's about some intergenerational impacts. Throughout this, I'm going to try to get into my name. I went from Antoine to Nakehk'o. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the stereotype of drunken Indians as well, too. We'll talk about colonialism versus colonization. One is the thinking, one is the action. For the legal audience, the doctrine of domination or doctrine of discovery, a papal bull way back in the day when Europeans are out exploring the world, that was an important piece of information that a lot of people don't really dwell on or think about it. But basically, pretty much all our legal systems in the United States and Canada are predicated based on the doctrine of discovery when it comes to land, when it comes to property. A lot of these things that kind of come down, and the one document that's still cited today is the doctrine of discovery. Some people call it the doctrine of domination. We'll get into that. But first, we're going to get into some terminology here. I usually work with young people, and I like to share this quote from Malcolm X. Malcolm X is one of my heroes and one of the reasons why I wanted to change my name from Antoine to Nakehk'o. But basically, Malcolm says, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. And I have found myself falling for anything in the past, mostly when I was younger, because I didn't have anything to stand on. Mostly my culture and my language and who I am as a Dene person, my identity. As I was searching for that, I didn't really have a lot to stand on. So I fell for a lot of things, and I'll share that stories with you a little bit. But if you don't have something to stand for, and then you'll fall for anything. So I am in Yellowknife, the traditional territory of the Yellowknife Dene. You know, by rights, we should all be speaking the Liidlii dialect because this is the language of the place that we live in. From my perspective, this language that I'm communicating and sharing in, from my perspective, I call it the colonizer's language because it's a foreign language from here. But it's pretty much the common tongue around the world. So we'll continue on this in what I call the colonizer's language, English. And English is tricky. I'm sure you guys know that as lawyers. There's a lot of things, words you could put in or add prefixes and different things that kind of can change the meaning of what you're trying to convey. So you got to have something to stand on and understand the language that we're using. For this, I'm going to use some certain terminology. And one is Dene. I am a Dene person, which is an Indigenous person from this area. This is pretty much the perspective that I'll be sharing with you. There's different interpretations of Dene. There's not one Webster Standard Dictionary definition of what it is. They are Indigenous people, but the word Dene can mean one person or many people. But my uncle Jerry, former chief of the Liidlii Kue First Nation, Jerry Antoine, he's a Dene philosopher and a historian, and he took the word, and Dene's got two syllables, Dene. And the first syllable, de, makes reference to flowing or to rivers or to water. Like the Mackenzie River, you know, this thing with colonization, this idea of discovery, you know, Alexander Mackenzie, first guy ever to see the river and discover it. So you got to have his name to it. But for a lot of different communities, we refer to that river as Dënche. And de is like in reference to river or flowing. Sunshine in our language, we say sa de. Sa is sun and de is like the light flowing from the sun. So de, that first part of Dene, makes reference to flowing or to river or to water. And the ne, the second syllable, makes reference to land. And if you drive out of Yellowknife, you get into Klitschko territory, you can see there are nice signs that says, welcome to Klitschko Ne. And they use NDE, and that means Klitschko lands. So in our very word that we have for ourselves as a human being, as Dene, makes reference to water and to land. So we're not above it, we're not below it, we're like a part of it, Dene. So that's my Uncle Jerry's interpretation. In the same family, his older brother, my Uncle Jonas Antoine, I call him a bush ninja because he's still out there. He harvested 2 moose last week and he's 80. So he's still doing the work out there. But he's a little bit more poetic. This time of year, mostly in September, early in the morning, you usually get a fog, a real fog inside the trees and in the willows. And that fog is just flowing into the willows on the land by the shore. And when the sun comes out, the heat of the sun kind of burns it up, and the mist and the fog is really brief, their time here. And our time here on this land as Dene has been since time immemorial, which basically means since people can remember, before people can remember time. Here in Yellowknife, they have stories of giant beavers in Yellowknife Bay. It's connected to a giant tree that's now in the Liidlii site. And those giant beavers used to swim and capsize people's canoes on the bay here. And people still have to share stories about that over here. But if you go to the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Museum, you can see a giant beaver skull on there that's dated to 10,000 years ago. So at the very least, our stories and our presence here is about 10,000 years ago, which is a long, long time. You know, it's before about almost 7,000 years before people started to keep track of the years, you know, or 2021. It's like before like the pyramids and stuff. We were here a long time. So that's really important to understand. And the time span we were here is like eons, it's a long time. And our life as Dene, we're just like the mist flowing in the trees. And we're there flowing on the land, but we're here ever so briefly. And in the span of time that we're here, we're just like a little speck. So as Dene, that's my Uncle Jonas's interpretation of what it means. So there's other interpretations out there from other Dene people and other families, but these are the interpretations that I like and I'm working with. If we're going to have to use the colonizer's language, I prefer the word Indigenous. Growing up, I was searching for my identity, and I was really fortunate to have a lot of strong mentors and uncles and aunties. My late Uncle Rene Lamotte was one of those. I used to go to him for all sorts of advice. As a young person, you're always trying to search for your own identity, but it seemed like there's a little extra mixture to that confusion as an Indigenous person, because there's all this terminology. You know, I've been called derogatory terms. Oh, you gotta excuse my dog. She's really into this topic. But there's a bunch of terms. Like I've been called a lot of derogatory terms. You know, been called the prairie N-word. You know, I've been called a savage, a redskin. You know, and officially, you know, I have an Indian status card. We've been referred to as First Nations, Aboriginal. So it's really confusing. It's like, what the heck am I? But he says you're Dene. Uncle Rene says you're Dene. But if you have to use an English word, he said he likes the term Indigenous. You know, a few years ago, Aboriginal was the term, but I didn't really like that term because it had the prefix AB, and AB as a prefix comes up in the English language different times. You know, you have normal, then you have abnormal, you have original, then you have Aboriginal. You know, I'm not really sure what they're trying to say, but you know, I didn't really like that term. But so Indigenous is a term that I like, and my definition that I work with comes from my Uncle Rene Lamotte. And to be considered Indigenous, you have to belong to a certain group of people that live in a specific geographic location. And the qualifier, the kicker, is to become Indigenous to the certain group of people live in that specific area. To become Indigenous to that area, those certain group of people got to live in that area for 10 generations or more. That group of people lives in a certain landmass, certain area for 10 generations or more. After 10 generations, the body starts to change genetically to adapt to the immediate surroundings. so that you're able to extrapolate all the nutrients you need to survive. And you create a long-lasting relationship with that place, but also with the land and the food around you. That's why traditional food is so important for Indigenous peoples like moose, caribou, fish, all those things that we have a relationship and we've been working and living with for thousands of years. So our bodies know how to extrapolate the nutrients from those things. Quick story, my late grandmother, Judith Buggins, she used to live at the Northern United Place, downtown Yellowknife, 611, used to go visit her. And as an old Dene elder, never had a lot of teeth, but we'd bring her caribou meat whenever we can. She'd cut it up, make dry meat, but she'd always boil it. She just boiled the heck out of it. She just had meat and boiled potatoes. And as a young person, I'm going to date myself. Back in the day, we had the 4 food groups. You know, we had the dairy, you know, you had your meats, your breads, and your veggies and fruits. And I noticed from that perspective, my granny wasn't having a complete balanced diet based on the old food guide. And so I was worried, you know, granny needs like veggies, you know, she needs breads, she's just eating meat, potatoes. And I was like worried. I talked to my mom, I'm worried about granny's health. I don't think she's getting a balanced diet. She's like, don't worry, as long as she has meat. And I was like, but you know, she's got meat, but we're like, what about veggies? You know, she needs some nice veggies. She's like, well, what do the caribou eat? I said, well, they eat vegetation, they eat lichen. I said, yeah, the caribou is able to eat those things and then turn it into energy into their meat. And then because we have a long relationship with that caribou, when we eat the caribou, harvest it, and consume it, our bodies are able to extrapolate the nutrients it needs from that meat because we have a long relationship. Because as Dene people, we've been living on this part of the world for over 10 generations or more for a long time. So it's very important to understand that Dene is the term that we use, but if you have to use a colonized language, I like to use the word Indigenous. And my definition of Indigenous comes from my uncle Rene, mean a certain group of people living in a specific geographic location for 10 generations and more. Another story, basketball related story. I got to be an official and a referee at the Arctic Winter Games in Greenland some games ago. Beautiful place, beautiful people, had lots of fun. But I got invited out. I met some people and they invited me to dinner. They had all this caribou. They cooked all this caribou. Oh, it was so good. But Greenland is colonized by Denmark. So we had all these Danish health professionals, some younger people, and we're having dinner, we're having a good visit. And some of the Danish medical health people were doing health research on the Greenlandic people. And what they were saying is that they found out that the Greenlandic people's digestive system was about 5 to 10% larger than other humans around the world. So they're doing research on why that was. And I asked why. They thought it was their diet. In Greenland, they're by the ocean. So, you know, Inuit food, mukta, seal, blubber, whales, a lot of oily kind of fatty foods from the ocean. And but it's stuff that they grew up with. You know, if I had a traditional Greenlandic diet, I'm not indigenous to that area. I'd eat it, but I'd probably need to know the location of the nearest bathroom at all times because, you know, I'm not indigenous. So if I eat the food, it'll probably just go right through me. But for Greenlandic people, they're indigenous to that area. So they're able to extrapolate all the nutrients they need from their immediate surroundings. So they're indigenous to that area. Dene people are indigenous, but we're not the only indigenous peoples out there. I got to go to Finland, hang out with some Sami people. And I found out there's some indigenous people that have blonde hair and blue eyes. And that really blew my mind because in my colonized thinking, I just thought all indigenous people were kind of the shade, but that's really not the case. So I just wanted to share that with you. And one of the things is that this definition of indigenous kind of works with our definition as Dene. Basically, we're one with the land, the water, and the land. And then after 10 generations, that's pretty much what happens to a certain group of people. For Canadians, for settlers, it's going to take a couple more generations, like, you know, our country's like 150 something years old. So that's probably 8 or 9 generations ago. But if your ancestors or your family have immigrated here, Did they stay in one specific geographic location? Maybe they came to the Maritimes and then eventually moved to Ontario or to the prairies or to the West Coast. So I know we have some families that are 4 or 5 generations. There's still got about 5 more generations to go for your body to change at the genetic level to be able to extrapolate all the nutrients it needs from its immediate surroundings. So it's so those are the definitions that I use when it comes to this. That's some terminology. I'm just going to get into a little bit of history here. We talk about colonialism. It's a mentality. It's a way of thinking that's pervasive all over the country. And I'm still trying to figure out how I'm colonized and how that has impacted me in a bunch of different ways. But to understand that, we have to understand the root word of colonization is colony. And we're going to get into the establishment of the first colonies here in North America. But first, we're going to go to this little video here. This is Buffy Sainte-Marie. I'm not related, but I definitely feel a strong kinship with her. So I refer to her as Auntie Buffy. But Auntie Buffy, knowledgeable in lots of different areas. And one of those areas is definitely when it comes to the history. And this is her kind of talking about reconciliation and trying to understand it here in Canada. But before she gets into it, she talks a little bit about trying to understand the doctrine of discovery and how it impacts us here in this part of the world. So with that, I'm just going to go to Auntie Buffy here for a little bit.
Is there space for that?
I think there is, and if I can get quite specific with you for a second, there's something that most people have never heard of that's sometimes called the Doctrine of Discovery, which we really should call the Doctrine of Domination, that came about by the popes in 1491, 92, 93, and later even in the
Des, when you mute, we lose Buffy as well.
Dracula, Ferdinand and Isabella, and the church.
My bad. Just
In
gonna
Europe.
didn't
It
want
was
to
the Inquisition.
people listening
Nobody
to
ever
drink
puts
water.
that together. There were serial killers on the thrones of Europe. Henry VIII, Vlad the Impaler, that's what you call Dracula. Ferdinand and Isabella, and the church. Forget Christianity for a second, which is very beautiful. Christ, very beautiful. But the racketeers who got a hold of Christianity, they put out this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, which we rephrase as the Doctrine of Domination, which said that if explorers from Portugal, Holland, France, England, Spain, if they're out exploring, they don't want to step on each other's toes. So the Pope says, if explorers are out discovering things and they come upon a land that is inhabited by people who are non-Christians, it is your duty to kill them, enslave them, or convert them. And if you convert them, then their job is to work for us. Of course, they were saying work for Christ. No, it's not how it turned out. So the Doctrine of Discovery is something that we have to deal with in Canada because it's embedded in Canadian law. It's embedded in American law, in the law of all of the countries who were colonized by those 5 European countries. And it's embedded in their laws, and it's still referred to in the 2000s. It's not a thing of the past. So it's not a matter of going back and learning all of history. It's not that we need to get across. What we need to get across is that we need to do away with the Doctrine of Discovery.
Yeah, there's Auntie Buffy Sainte-Marie, and very eloquently kind of over a lot of history in a short time about the reasoning behind the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's something that is still with us today. And she's right, it's still cited in a lot of different cases all over. So that's the beginning of the mentality on this idea, this way of thinking. And that's where colonialism, when you use the term colonialism, it's mostly the planning and the thinking about it, the theory. Like, okay, in England, they're like, all right, we're going to go to Canada and we're going to set up shop. We're going to take all the furs, going to put all the kids in schools, we're going to make them speak English and be civilized. And so that's the idea, the theory behind it. And then colonization is the action of actually doing those things. So Scott Duncan and what's the first prime minister, Johnny Mack, they got together and they're the architects of the residential school system. So they were planning the theory and the policy, and that's colonialism that they were talking about. But once they implemented the Indian residential school system here in Canada, that was action, that was colonization in action. So when we talk about colonization and colonialism is a way of thinking, it's this mentality, and it's archaic and it's old, and we definitely need to change it. So that was the Doctrine of Discovery in the United States. In some places yesterday or the day before, some people still celebrate Columbus Day in a lot of different areas to celebrate the discovery of North America. And this is another thing about colonial myth making of the past, about how these people can discover these areas when there was already people in those areas living and thriving in their own cultures and societies, in their own histories. I don't really like to talk about Christopher Columbus. I think he's one of those figures in history we should just forget about and just not talk about it. He's a horrible person. He kind of after his voyage, his discovery, because he was all these crimes, the Spanish monarchy threw him in jail and they locked him up, and he just died alone because he did some horrible things to people over there. And the one legacy that he did bring was this idea of the easy acceptance of atrocities as deplorable, but a necessary price to pay for progress. That is his legacy, and that attitude and mentality is still with us today. This comes from a book, A People's History of the United States, from the late Howard Zinn. Great book. Usually history is written from the winners, but Howard Zinn took the perspective of the people, I guess you'd refer to as the losers, the people that didn't come out top. So the history from the perspective of Black people, of Indigenous people, of women who are not really don't populate our history books so much. So Howard Zinn says, this is the legacy of Christopher Columbus: the easy acceptance of atrocities, deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress. As the Italian sailor was sponsored by the Spanish monarchy, they were looking for gold back in the day. When they came, they landed on the Puerto Rican islands and they met with the Arawak, or the Taino people. And then they greeted them with generosity and kindness. And then in the United States, Indigenous people sometimes self-identify as Indian. I'm American Indian, not so much in Canada, but in the United States they do. And their reasoning for that comes from that first encounter between the Taino Arawak and the Spanish. The Spanish were really impressed with their generosity and their hospitality. They swam out to meet them. They gave them gifts. They're completely almost naked. It's like paradise over there. And in Jesuit journals, they wrote that these people are, in Spanish, their demeanor is indios. In Spanish, in is with and dios is God. So their demeanor is like with God. They're so generous and kind. So some American Indians cite that as why they self-identify as Indian, comes from indios. So they're looking for gold, and they did horrible things. They would Christopher Columbus would place bets with his his conquistadors, and they would have bets like they would get 2 soldiers and they would get 2 people, and they would say stuff like, can you chop this person in half with one slice of your sword? And they would put bets on it, and they would just take random people. They would just take random people and they would ask them to look for gold and give them a time limit of 2 days. They have to come back with gold in 2 days. And if they came back and they didn't have any gold, they'd actually cut their hands off and use a necklace of it. So this is like documented history. So they were looking for gold, but because it was discovery and the meeting of these 2 worlds, those things are atrocities. Those things are deplorable, but it's a necessary price to pay for progress. That's the attitude it came. If you fast forward to close to this time, we live in Yellowknife, or in the shadow of giant mine. Again, they're looking for gold. And part of the mining process of gold is that you had the arsenic trioxide that was used to separate the gold from the ore. And for the lifespan of giant mine, there's accumulated a mountain of frozen arsenic trioxide that they buried underneath Yellowknife and all the tunnels. And it's actually 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide buried under Yellowknife. That's 7.5 of the Belenka, the movie theater building, 7.5 of those buildings full of arsenic trioxide. Enough is one teaspoon is enough to kill a human being. 237,000 tons. You know what? I'd call that an atrocity. I'd call that deplorable. But the economy, jobs, it's a necessary price to pay for progress. So that attitude is still with us. So the beginning of it was the Doctrine of Discovery to pretty much say that we're not human. So people have to come over and take control of us and tell us what to do. And then, but also, since we're not human, we don't have God in our lives or the church, the presence of the church. So they can kill us and do whatever they want with us. So the easy acceptance of atrocities as deplorable, but a necessary price to pay for progress. Those attitudes are still alive and well with us here today. So we talk about colonization, the root word is colony. And this next video clip is from a PBS show called Finding Your Roots with Louis Gossett Gates Jr. He's a historian and a professor, and then the show is really good. Basically, they take celebrities and they do their genealogy, and they do these interviews. And this episode had specifically had to do with Latin America, Latino people. But this part, it's a short part of this show. It talks about the establishment of the first colonies here in North America, just kind of north of the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot of things here, and then I'm going to play it, then we'll talk about it in a bit here.
Than I ever imagined. We couldn't track Luis's story any further, but it illustrates a basic fact about the history of Spanish settlers and Native Americans. They often had children with each other. The Spaniards, who began pouring into the New World over 500 years ago, didn't arrive on an empty continent, and they didn't bring many females with them. So throughout the Americas, many Spanish settlers, either through rape or willing relationships, had children both with Native Americans and their African slaves, filling their colonies with people who didn't look particularly Spanish. Then, to police genetic boundaries, the Spaniards constructed class systems based on color. They invented terms like mulatto and mestizo, and created elaborate anthropological paintings to describe these new racial mixtures. And they organized their societies to keep the whitest people in charge. Whiteness was so important that people with limited mating choices sometimes married their own relatives rather than risk diluting the purity of their bloodline.
Yeah, got kind of like into Game of Thrones territory there near the end, but this is a great show. You should check it out, Finding Your Roots. But it illustrated a bunch of different points here that kind of goes into, that relates to the topics that I think we're talking about. The first colonies, from the Spanish, root word for colonization is colony. And they established these colonies based on class systems, based on race. And they said they kept it so they had the whitest people on top and everybody else on the bottom. They had a couple of terms that they created these new terms like mulatto, half Spanish, half African slave. I'm just going to caution people in some circles out there that term is a derogatory term, but I just wanted to mention it. They mentioned it here. Also, the other term that's really interesting is mestizo, which is half Spanish and half indigenous. It's a term that we still use. We just use the Francophone version there. It's called Métis now, but I think the root word of mestizo kind of goes back. So it's mestizo, then it's Métis. But for me, from my perspective, that means that idea of Métis, of that mestizo, is it's a European concept because it came from the Spanish, and they're the ones who had these things. It's not an indigenous concept. So that idea of these splitting of the races and having class structures based on race was established in the first colonies that the Spanish had way back in the day. And they had anthropological paintings to describe these new racial mixtures, always preferring to have whiteness at the top. So that was over 500 years ago. But how much has our mentality changed? How much has our societies changed? How much does our communities change when it comes to those types of attitudes of like putting a certain color of people over other color of people? It's the beginnings of basically white supremacy, meaning like that white people are more superior, so they should be in charge and be calling the shots. And this is embedded within the first colonies established in North America. And if we fast forward to today, if we look at all our prime ministers or presidents or CEOs or directors or principals or superintendents, all the people in those decision-making power positions, can kind of take, how many indigenous people are in those, how many Black people or how many women. So that idea of whiteness and as being an elevated status within our society, it has its roots way back here in the setting up the first colonies by the Spanish, and that's way over 500 years ago. But we still have that mentality and that attitude within our own communities and within our own societies today. So even though we're in 2021, we're advanced, got all this technology, our way of thinking and our mentality is old, it's archaic, it's like over 500 years ago. So these are some of the things that I think are important to share when it comes to trying to understand where we are today. So we had the Doctrine of Discovery, right? And then we had the Italian sailor as atrocities is deplorable, but necessary price to pay for progress. But also this idea of elevating whiteness over everybody else basically started in the first colonies. So if we're talking about colonization and colonialism, yeah, got to start at the first colonies here in North America. So from there, things just kind of snowballed. We went from being the only people here to becoming the enemy of the people that took basically our lands away from us. And then, there's this process we had to have the Indian problem and fix this Indian problem. Here in Canada, we used to have it's Northern and Indigenous Affairs now. Basically, it used to be Indian Affairs back in the day, and used to have the Director General. And when Canada first started with Johnny Mack, Indian Affairs was under the War Department. So that's how they first thought about Indians, is that, oh, Indian Affairs, yeah, it's in the War Department, because they're our enemy, we got to get rid of them. And then the Director General was actually a general from the army. So that's the beginnings of our country, and a lot of our government kind of offices. Those are some of the things that have happened in our past. And it led to this idea where you have to try to fix them. And then basically they try to kill us, they try to eradicate us. That was the plan, but we're still here. I'm still here talking with you today. So it goes to show how strong and resilient we are as people. Because it couldn't get rid of all of us, the idea was to assimilate us and to make us like them. And that led to a lot of creative ideas by Canadians. One of them was the Indian residential school system, which we now know is wrong. If you haven't had a chance to check out the Truth and Reconciliation report, I know you guys do a lot of reading, but I would encourage you. There's 94 calls to action in there. Some of them have to do with law. Also, they referred to what happened to Indigenous peoples here in Canada as cultural genocide. They added cultural in there to kind of soften the blow of like just saying straight up genocide. But a few years after that, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls had 231 calls to justice. And they just got rid of the cultural stuff, and they said what basically is happened and is continuing to happen is genocide of Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women and girls. So these are some resources out there for lots of different people to try to understand a little bit more about the history. And then, but I wanted to share that with you. And that's basically, when I think of like all our my cousins and my relatives basically that are hanging outside the post office here in Yellowknife, a lot of those people didn't choose to be there. It's not like a life goal to hang outside the post office. You know, if you in kindergarten, you're in a circle with all these little kindergarten kids, you know, if you say, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know, it's policeman, lawyer, astronaut, or something. No little kid puts up their hand and says, I want to be a drunk hanging outside the post office. So it's not like a life goal. So when they were younger to now, there's a bunch of things that have happened to them they were forced into, and that kind of led them to where they are today. And a lot of those are a lot of the decisions made by Canadians, Canadian policy, Canadian law, and it's all kind of predicated based on these colonial ideas and this mentality that's out there that's really prevalent and still prevalent today in our country. So those people on the street, you know, they're people, and a lot of them are our relatives as well too. And I think it's really important to kind of understand that. But there is definitely a prevailing stereotype for Indigenous people about the drunk Indian, mostly because those are the ones that are most visible. They're hanging out downtown, people are walking downtown, and then they see them, you encounter them, and you see them every day. But you don't see the Indigenous people that are out on the trap line, you know, that are working on hides, that are out there hunting and fishing, because, you know, most of the majority of our people are not out there doing those things, just our Indigenous peoples. So the people that are at this, like their whole livelihood has to do with in communities, in cities. Yeah, if you walk by these people and you see them every day, that's, you know, that's what you're going to see them, and it kind of builds into the stereotype. But this is John Trudell. He's like a lightning rod to the soul. He passed away. He's one of my heroes as well too. His videos are all over YouTube. Spoken word artist. In the United States, the FBI had the largest individual file on this guy. Didn't murder anybody, didn't do any non-terrorist. It was just the way he talked about things that he was such a threat to the establishment of the United States. But here's a little video, and John's kind of addressing the stereotype of a drunken Indians here. Again, not related, but definitely feel a kinship to this guy, John Trudell.
Opening a path that later led.
Well, about the whole idea of the drunken Indian, I mean, I don't remember what I said before, but I know without them, we wouldn't be here today, the Native peoples. I mean, that because there was a time as a Native person in America, I mean, obviously we went from being the only people here to where we became the enemy of the people who came to take it away from us. And you know, and this is what genocide and manifest destiny was all about. So we had that experience. And then by the 1900s, by the beginning of the 1900s, pretty much we had all been confined and contained into reservations or whatever, and then taken off into the educational religious systems as children, taken away. And as that was happening, taking the children away, and this was not an aberration. Taking the children of the Native people was the standard. So, and feeding them off into the religious educational systems. So basically, they were telling the Native people that we couldn't be who we were anymore, Indian. We couldn't be Indians. We needed to be white. And I think that so here we were, historically speaking, in a situation where we couldn't be who we were, and we didn't want to be, right? Who our oppressor wanted us to be. So I think that's what that whole period of that whole period of that drunken Indian time, that so-called period of time where the drunken Indian, where that image and that stereotypical thing came. But this is the Indian that saved us. Because this is the Indian that said, I'm not going to, I can't be who I am, and I'm not going to be who you tell me to be. So I'll just be nothing. I'll be something else. I'll just do my time and get through it. I'll erase the pain, and I'll just do what I have to get through it. but I will not become you. And really, I think that, and I think I think that they're the ones who saved something about us as Native people by refusing to submit. This was their rebellion. This was their way. And then later when the activists came along, see, I always felt that they made it possible for us activists later, because if they hadn't taken that route, they would have had to have the white mind or be destroyed from trying to be who they really are. So they protected the identity of who they really were, right? Through this mask, wearing this disguise. I'm a human being. You will not recognize me as a human being, as who I truly am. So I will hide that, because I will hide that behind this so that you don't kill me.
Yeah, John Trudell there, Uncle John, and lots of points. This is me not advocating that we should all be drunks to combat colonialism. No. But, at a certain point in time, that was the only way for people to keep something of our own identity of who we were as Indigenous folks. And there's a lot of people that are still like that today. When I made reference to the people that are hanging out in front of the post office, they aren't able to be who they really are, and they don't want to be the people that they're forced to be. So they're just doing this thing. They're saying like 2 middle fingers to the whole world and say, you know what, screw it, I'm not going to do it. And this is how I'm going to function now as a human being. Since I can't be who I want to be, I don't want to be who you want me to be. So basically, you just come to this point where they have to like mask the pain, and it's a kind of a form of rebellion against the impacts of colonization and colonialism. Yeah, so those are some of the things that I wanted to share with you from, I guess, some of the things that I've learned along the way that help me make sense of why things are the way they are. A couple of things here as I kind of wrap up. Malcolm X, he's one of my heroes, and back in the day, his name was Malcolm Little, and he got into trouble. Was a thief. Got thrown in jail for a while. While in jail, he educated himself, and he started to learn about the history, especially about slavery, since he was a Black guy. And he learned about slave names. So basically, when African people were sold as property, as slaves, they were given to a slave owner, and they would take the slave owner's name to designate that slave as that slave owner's property. So just for a crazy example, since I was a slave owner and then maybe I bought Glenn as a slave, then Glenn would be known as Nakehk'o to kind of show that, he's my property, just in a crazy kind of what if. Not going to happen, but that's how it was. So as Malcolm started to learn more about history, he didn't like that idea that his whole identity was basically, he was named after his slave owner, Little. So he wanted to retrace his roots back to Africa, but there was no way he could find out which part of the continent or which people he came from. So as he started to become a learned man, he in mathematics, you have X, and X is the problem you're trying to solve, is the unknown. A plus B equals X. So that's what he took, because that was the problem he was trying to solve. And that was the unknown for him, was his family lineage, his name. So that's why he took Malcolm X. And when I read that, I was like, whoa, I thought that was really badass. And it made me think about my own name, Antoine, at that time. And I was wondering where that came from, because it's a French name, and I'm not French. So I was talking to different people. One of my aunties told me that they changed her name in residential school. Her name was Nakehk'o. And then part of the process of residential school is they gave people names. A lot of residential schools run by French nuns and priests. They took a vow of celibacy, but it didn't stop a lot of them. So they weren't able to pass along their family names. So what they did was they assigned their own names to little Indian kids in residential schools. The French, my dad says, they would refer to their residential school kids as mon petit sauvage. Mon petit sauvage is what they called all the little kids in residential school. And so they changed their names. So Antoine was assigned to our family in residential school by some of the administrators. And you think about the North, there's a lot of French surnames like Beaulieu, Mercredi, Ménacroche, Bonnet Rouge. So it was a process that happened up here to a lot of different families, not just mine. So when I learned that, I, like Malcolm associated Little as a slave name, I associated Antoine as my residential school slave name. It represents a time when the government policy is to take little kids, my dad and my aunties and uncles, and they are forced in residential school and treated horribly. And there was no way for them to talk back or to question. They're just like, this is your name. If you don't like it, I'm gonna lock you in the dark closet for a little bit longer so you accept it. There was no way to kind of fight back. So for me, Antoine was my residential school name, and I wanted to put two middle fingers up to it. I wanted to be Dneze X. I thought that'd be so cool. I'd be go to a restaurant and your table's ready, Mr. X. And I'd be like, right on, fight the power. But that's unlike Malcolm. I was able to retrace my roots back to my family to the person that I had a traditional Dene name, and that was my great grandfather on my father's side. It was Nakehk'o. Nakeh is two, and K'o is fires. So it was two fires. So it took me about a 3-year process to talk to some elders, aunties and uncles, to see if it was okay for me to take on that name. And I got permission in my family, and I actually paid for all that stuff myself. I did a name change. And then I got to understand what it's like to go for women, if they get married and they do a name change. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of different things you got to do. You got to make sure all your documents are done right. But so that's something that I did, is that it's, there's a lot of things taken from us, but there's certain things that we can do as individuals to take things back and to kind of, make things right for me. So I'm not French, and residential school happened to my family, but it does not define who we are in my family. I'm Dene, and so I gotta have a Dene name. So, and kudos to my parents. When I were born, they gave us all Dene names. I'm Dëneze, my sister is Mila, my brother is Sache, and my other brother is Tamba. So they all gave us Dene names from the beginning, but it was the surname that we changed. And when I changed the surname, it made me think about different things like the Mackenzie River. Actually think about the Great Slave Lake. That's actually a horrible name. Was there like slavery up here? Was there one slave that was greater than the others? If you think about Great Slave, it's actually pretty horrible if you think about it, especially if you have a history of slavery in your family. Maybe if you're Black, I'd be hesitant to come up and live to a place that's next to the Great Slave Lake, or even Slave Lake, Alberta, if you really think about it. But we don't even think about it now. We just kind of adopted it and accepted it. So much so that geographically, if you guys do work north of the lake, you guys work in the North Slave region. If south of the lake, we work in the South Slave region. We even had the South Slave Arctic Winter Games. We don't even think about it. We're just it's just been normalized to the point where, if I point it out, then people kind of say I'm the troublemaker causing things. But what does that say about us as individuals that live here if we're okay and we're normalizing that type of language and those type of attitudes here in the North? Even our name, the Northwest Territories, is not even a name. It's just a direction from Ottawa. It's like people in the South didn't care enough to let us have our own name. It's just like if you have a son and a daughter, it's like naming them boy and girl. Just like, hey, what's that area? Oh, don't worry, that's just the Northwest Territory. So as our own identity collectively here in the NWT, or as I refer to Denendeh, we don't really have our own identity to kind of glom onto. We're just like a direction from Ottawa. So those names and our identity and those things that we let slide says a lot about us as individuals as well too. Paul Andrews, one of my mentors, and he talks about what happened in residential school was dysfunctional behavior, and it normalized dysfunctional behavior within our communities. So it's normal for a kid to start drinking at 11. It's normal for a young woman to be sexually assaulted by a family member. You know, and then it's like, oh, join the club. Yeah, it happens all the time. And that stuff is like the normalization of the dysfunctional behaviors to a point where someone says, hey, you know, drinking at a young age is bad, or, you know, you should not sexually assault young girls. You know, then, you know, the person that are calling that out, you know, they look like they're not the normal person. So from an Indigenous perspective, it's the normalization of dysfunctional behavior within our communities that's so prevalent. And you guys see the effects of that at your work as well, too. But colonization, colonialism is a coin. If you look at it as a coin, on one side, it impacts Indigenous people. It normalizes dysfunctional behavior within our communities. But if you look on the other side, it impacts all of us within our society. I personally believe it's the #1 reason for our high rates of anxiety and depression within our society, because I know that this way of thinking is not conducive to the human spirit. So it impacts all of us. And if you think about it, you know, if you look at our country, you know, we're in a climate crisis. You know, we're in the pandemic. We're in an economic crisis with the wage gap, the disparity between rich and poor. That gap is growing. You know, we're in a pandemic. We got billionaires going to space, and all these things. And then you have this hatred for like Indigenous people within this country. It's almost like a Canadian value to like hate on Indigenous peoples. And those types of attitudes are dysfunctional as well, too. So on the other side of the coin, you know, we have the normalization of dysfunctional behavior within our greater society as well, too. You know, there's bodies being discovered in unmarked graves at all these schools, supposed to be schools, basically torture camps as these residential schools. The list is up to like 6,000 individuals that have found. You know, that's dysfunctional behavior, but we're normalizing it within our society as well, too. So I think the one thing that I like people to take away is that these impacts of colonization and colonialism impacts all of us. All of us. It's just that the Indigenous peoples are basically the canary in the coal mine. So they're like, you know what, this residential school stuff, it doesn't work. You know, taking our land, it's not going to work. So we have a lot of different potential. And then I think we live in a great place here in the North. We have a lot of things going for us. One of the things that I think is really exciting is that we live in a land that we're creating new forms of government here. You know, we've got the Nakehk'o government. That's different from the Canadian government. If from my perspective, the Nakehk'o government is the most Canadian government we have, because it was created by Canadians and Indigenous peoples coming together, meeting the minds. They created an agreement, and they created a system of government for a specific geographic location. It makes sense for the people that live here. You know, we're operating under a colonial system that was originated in the United Kingdom. You know, the House of Commons, the parliamentary over there, it was created in another part of the world with a country maybe this big. And they were trying to take this way of governing into our landmass of our country this big. You know, that doesn't translate over to here. So you know, there's a lot of things that we need to do, but I think working with Indigenous peoples, especially through land claims, is definitely the most exciting thing that's happening in a long time. We get to be a part and have a say in the creation of these different governments. But land back I think is the goal for a lot of Indigenous people. And it's not like we're going to take all the land and kick all the white people out. No, you know, we've been oppressed and we know what that's like. And that's not what we want in the future. Basically, it's just a return to our homeland so we can start to make decisions and then come to this sort of this place of decolonization, which is a scary place because no one knows what it's like and no one knows what it's going to be like because we haven't been there before. So it's definitely a journey that we have to go hand in hand and do together because where we are now is really not working. So there's a lot of things that we need to work on together. And I think it starts by trying to come up to some sort of human understanding of each other to bring more awareness so that we can work together in a better way that's not like these archaic ways that are so prevalent. And yeah, so basically those are some of the things that I wanted to share with the Law Society here. Again, I apologize if, you know, I don't want to make people feel bad. I don't want to blame. Again, these are just some of the things that, you know, have helped me to try to understand and make sense of the things that are impacting me as an individual. And I share this presentation with high school to older people, to a lot of different people out there as well too. And if there's things that are my journey that you can use in your life, please, you can use all of this and use it to incorporate it. And then, yeah, but basically, that's what I wanted to share with everybody today. I don't know if I'm over time or if we have any questions or anything, but I don't mind hanging out until and answering some questions.
Great. Thanks, Dneze. There's a lot of things there, and I sometimes try and summarize the talks, but there's just too many things there for me to try and summarize. Let me ask you one thing, though. You talked about how when we go through the journey of decolonization or go towards decolonization, we need some human understanding. So if I came to you and said, Dneze, give me 3 or 4 things that I could do that would help, what would you tell me to do?
Adopt an elder. Paul Andrew's really good. You could adopt an elder. And then by adopt an elder, just like visit with an elder and get to build that relationship. I think too is to try to understand a little bit more of the history you live in. If you're living and working here in Yellowknife, try to learn about the Yellowknife Dene, try to learn about the history, try to learn a little bit of the language. Komodo good morning. I know if you have some kids, they probably learned in school and stuff, but that goes a long way. If you say Komodo say good morning to a Yellowknife Dene elder, that'll impress them. They'll be like, oh, wow, so cool. And then try to be a good ally. And then not take up space, but I think the idea is to hold space, and then to hold space, and then just on your own individual kind of journey. I had a chance to talk with this Indigenous writer, Two-Spirit queer writer, Joshua Whitehead. He's got a book called Johnny Appleseed. It's pretty cool, but he comes up with this. He has this term about colonial constellations, which I like to use as well too. But basically there's stars out there, and then you can connect the dots and then create a little like Orion's belt or, the Big Dipper or whatever. But once you understand a little bit more about history, about the impacts of colonization, you start to create these colonial constellations and this better understanding of why things are the way they are within our communities and within our societies as well too. So I would encourage people to try to come up with your own colonial constellations to try to understand why things are the way they are a little bit better. And then, this is a tough one, but just to have patience, to hold space and to have patience with people, because everybody's on their learning, their healing journey and their learning journey. And some of us are a little further ahead and some of us are a little further behind. But the idea is to be able to walk together, to try to not leave anybody behind. So sometimes that takes patience, and that's something that I'm working on, because I see a lot of wrong in the world and I want to change it immediately. But I have to have patience to make sure that I hold space for the people that are learning and healing as well too. I don't want to leave anybody behind.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah.
This is your last chance, anybody. If you've got any questions for Dneze, pop them in the chat function. A reminder that we're recording this session, and this afternoon we'll put it up on the Law Society YouTube channel. I know I'm going to go back and look at it again, because there was an awful lot of stuff there that I could stand to listen to one more time and learn from one more time. Okay, Des, I don't see anything. Listen, I really want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for the work you put into this. I want to thank you for the thought-provoking comments that you've given to all of us. And with that, everyone, thank you and have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Dneze.
Thanks. Appreciate you guys having the patience and listening to me. I know you guys listen to a lot of people and you process a lot of information. But I just want to thank everybody for the work that they're doing as well too. I know it's kind of sometimes a thankless job, but I see you out there. I see you guys. So thanks again there, Glenn. Thanks to the Law Society, and hey, maybe we could do this again sometime.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.